Story 1. This happened during my sophomore year of college, when I moved into a small, cheap apartment a few blocks from campus. The place was run down, with creaky wooden floors, peeling yellow paint, and a draft that made the windows whistle at night. It wasn't much, but it fit my budget. The building was eerily quiet. I rarely saw other tenants, and even when I did, they barely made eye contact. The dim, flickering hallway lights didn't help the atmosphere, making it feel like I'd moved into a ghost town instead of an apartment complex. The first week passed without much incident. I focused on unpacking, getting used to my new part-time job at the coffee shop, and settling into classes. But small, unsettling things started happening. At first, they were easy to dismiss. My shoes weren't where I left them, the blinds were slightly open when I was sure I'd closed them, and the bathroom mirror always seemed to have streaks that I didn't remember leaving. I told myself it was just my imagination, or maybe I was too distracted to notice. Then, one night while I was studying in the living room, I heard footsteps. They were faint at first, a light tapping sound coming from above me. It didn't strike me as odd at first. After all, I assumed someone lived in the apartment above. But the sound continued, growing louder and more erratic. The footsteps didn't follow a normal pattern. It was as if someone was pacing, then suddenly running, then stopping altogether. I sat frozen on the couch, listening intently. When I finally checked the time, it was 2:14 a.m. The sound stopped as abruptly as it started, leaving me in silence. The next morning, I ran into Mr. Clay, the landlord, while heading out. I casually mentioned the footsteps, expecting some explanation about the upstairs neighbor. Instead, he looked at me with a puzzled expression and said, "There's no one living above you. That unit's been empty for years." I laughed nervously, thinking he must be mistaken, but his expression didn't change. "It's been locked up since the last tenant moved out. Probably just the old pipes creaking," he added dismissively before walking away. His words lingered in my mind the rest of the day. That night, the footsteps returned. But this time, they weren't just above me, they were in the hallway outside my door. My heart pounded as I sat motionless, staring at the gap under the door. A shadow passed by, slow and deliberate, pausing for a moment before disappearing. I tried to convince myself it was just one of the other tenants. Maybe someone had trouble sleeping and decided to walk around. I locked my bedroom door before going to bed, but sleep was impossible. Every creak and groan of the building made me jump. Around 3 a.m., I heard the faint but unmistakable sound of my doorknob turning. My chest tightened as the handle rattled gently, then with more force. I lay frozen in bed, too terrified to move. Eventually, the sound stopped, and the silence that followed was deafening. The next morning, I cautiously approached the door, dreading what I might find. The doorknob itself looked fine, but the wood around it had faint, jagged scratches, as if someone had been trying to pick the lock. My stomach churned as I realized this wasn't just in my head. Someone, or something, had been there. After discovering the scratches around the doorknob, I couldn't shake the unease that settled deep in my chest. Every creak in the floorboards and gust of wind through the drafty windows felt like a threat. I started second-guessing myself, questioning whether I'd locked the door properly or if I was just overreacting to my new surroundings. But the scratches were real. Someone had tried to get into my room. That night, I double-checked every lock in the apartment. The front door had a flimsy chain lock, which I engaged for the first time since moving in. I even wedged a chair under the doorknob like I'd seen in old movies. It felt silly, but it gave me some comfort. My bedroom door stayed locked, too, and I kept my phone charging on the nightstand, just in case. I drifted into a restless sleep, but it didn't last long. Around 2 a.m., a faint tapping sound pulled me from my dreams. It wasn't coming from the hallway this time, it was coming from the living room. My body froze as I strained to listen. Tap, tap, tap. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and close. I couldn't convince myself it was just the building settling. The sound moved, creeping closer, until it was right outside my bedroom door. My breath hitched as the doorknob jiggled softly. Whoever was on the other side wasn't in a rush, it was as if they were testing my reaction, waiting. My phone was in my hand before I realized it. I opened the flashlight app and aimed it at the door, though it didn't make me feel any safer. The doorknob stopped moving, and silence fell. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours, every nerve on edge. Finally, I forced myself to whisper, "Who's there?" No response. My heart thundered in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. I stayed awake until dawn, the flashlight still aimed at the door, but nothing else happened. When morning came, I stepped into the living room, my body tense with dread. Everything looked normal, except for the blinds on the window, they were fully open. I knew I'd closed them the night before. My stomach churned as I scanned the room, half expecting someone to be hiding in the shadows. The front door was still locked, the chain in place, and the chair was still wedged under the knob. Whoever had been inside hadn't come through the front. I called Mr. Clay that afternoon to report the incident. His dismissive tone only made me angrier. "It's probably just some kids messing around. These old buildings make noises all the time," he said. When I brought up the scratches on the door, he sighed. "I'll check the locks when I have time." That night, I couldn't bring myself to stay in the apartment. I packed a bag and went to stay with my friend Sarah, who lived a few blocks away. She listened patiently as I recounted the events, but I could tell she was skeptical. "Maybe it's just stress," she said, trying to reassure me. "You've got a lot on your plate right now." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to think I was just imagining things, that the footsteps, the shadows, and the scratches were all in my head. But deep down, I knew they weren't. When I returned to the apartment the next day, it felt different. The silence was heavier, almost oppressive, as if the building itself was watching me. I checked every room, every closet, even under the bed, but nothing seemed out of place. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I decided to set a trap. I placed a glass jar filled with marbles just inside the front door, positioned so that anyone entering would knock it over. I set my phone to record audio and left it on the kitchen counter before retreating to my locked bedroom. I barely slept. Every sound outside my door made my pulse spike. But the jar stayed upright, and the audio recording didn't pick up anything unusual. For a moment, I thought maybe I was safe. Maybe it really was all in my head. Then, just before dawn, I heard it again. The soft, deliberate tapping, this time, coming from the window in my bedroom. The tapping on my bedroom window froze me in place. My apartment was on the second floor, and there was no balcony or fire escape outside that window. Whatever was out there didn't make sense. I stared at the window, holding my breath, as the tapping continued, soft and rhythmic, like someone drumming their fingers on the glass. Slowly, I reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight, pointing it at the window. The light reflected back at me, illuminating only the closed blinds. I couldn't see anything beyond them. The tapping stopped. My room fell silent, but I could feel the hair on my arms standing on end. I didn't dare move for what felt like an eternity, afraid of what might be waiting for me on the other side of the blinds. Then, I heard a faint creak, like the sound of weight shifting on wood. My heart pounded as I realized it was coming from the living room. Clutching my phone tightly, I crept toward my bedroom door, trying not to make a sound. My hand trembled as I unlocked the door and peeked out. The living room was pitch black, and everything was still, no shadows, no movement. The chair was still wedged under the front door handle. But the blinds on the living room window were wide open again. I stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the wide-open blinds. A cold draft swept through the living room, even though the windows were shut tight. The silence was suffocating, but I could feel something was wrong. It wasn't just the open blinds, it was the air, the heavy tension that made the room feel alive with an unseen presence. Summoning all my courage, I stepped into the living room, phone light sweeping across the walls and furniture. Everything was exactly where it should have been, except for the blinds. I inched closer, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe I had left them open earlier without realizing it. Then, I noticed it. On the window pane, faint but unmistakable, were handprints. Smudged and streaked as if someone had pressed their palms and dragged them downward. The prints were too large to belong to a child and too defined to be old stains. My stomach sank. A loud crash shattered the silence, making me jump. It came from the kitchen. My phone light flickered as I turned to face the hallway. The jar of marbles I'd placed by the door had tipped over, its contents scattered across the floor. My heart raced. Someone had been inside, and now, they were here. I backed toward my bedroom, my eyes darting between the living room and the hallway. As I reached the door, I heard slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the kitchen. My chest tightened as I locked myself inside, my trembling hands fumbling to push the dresser in front of the door. The footsteps grew louder, stopping just outside. And then, the doorknob started to turn. The doorknob twisted slowly, the faint metallic sound sending chills down my spine. My heart pounded as I pressed my back against the dresser, bracing myself for whatever was on the other side. The door rattled, first gently, then violently, as if someone, or something, was desperate to get in. I clutched my phone, my only source of light, and whispered a silent prayer. Then, it stopped. The silence was deafening, broken only by my shallow breaths. I strained to listen, my ear inches from the door. A heavy thud sounded, followed by retreating footsteps. The floor creaked as the intruder moved back toward the living room. I didn't dare move, but through the thin walls, I heard the blinds rattle and the faint sound of the front door unlocking. Minutes felt like hours as I sat frozen, waiting to be sure they were gone. Finally, summoning my courage, I moved the dresser aside and opened the door a crack. The apartment was eerily still. My phone light swept over the living room, and my stomach dropped. The front door was wide open. I stepped closer, trembling, and noticed something I hadn't seen before. Scratched into the wood of the doorframe were words, crude but legible, "I'll be back." I slammed the door shut, locked it, and called the police. By the time they arrived, there was no trace of anyone. The handprints on the window, the scratches on my door, and the overturned jar were all the evidence they had to go on. The officers' calm assurances did little to ease my terror. I moved out the next day, leaving behind everything except the essentials. I couldn't stay there, not after what had happened. To this day, I don't know who, or what, was in my apartment that night. But I do know one thing: sometimes, silence isn't empty. It's waiting. Story 2. This happened during my junior year of college when I was renting a house with 3 friends just off campus. The house was old but spacious, with creaky floors and thick wooden doors that made it feel like it belonged in another century. We loved it, though. It was cheap, close to class, and big enough for all of us to have our own rooms. During our first week there, we were still unpacking and settling in. One evening, as we were arranging furniture in the living room, we noticed a door at the end of the hallway that none of us remembered seeing before. It was plain, unremarkable, and painted the same beige color as the walls, which might explain why we overlooked it. Curious, we tried opening it, but it wouldn't budge. There was no lock, just a simple knob that wouldn't turn. Maybe it's a closet, my friend Mark suggested. But there were already several closets in the house, and something about this door felt off. It wasn't flush with the wall, as if it had been hastily installed, and the frame looked warped, almost crooked. We joked about it, calling it the mystery door, and went back to unpacking. That night, I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, when I heard faint sounds coming from the hallway. It was soft at first, like a faint creaking, but it grew louder, footsteps, slow and deliberate. I assumed it was one of my roommates and called out, "Mark? Sarah?" No response. The footsteps stopped outside my door. I held my breath, waiting, but nothing happened. Eventually, I got up and opened the door. The hallway was empty. The mystery door, however, was ajar. I stepped closer, heart racing, and peered inside. The room was pitch black, colder than the rest of the house, and smelled faintly of damp earth. I fumbled for my phone flashlight, and when I switched it on, the beam barely seemed to cut through the darkness. The space looked larger than I expected, far larger than it should have been based on the layout of the house. And then, I saw it. In the center of the room was a small, wooden chair, tipped on its side. Beneath it, the floor was covered in scratches, as if something had clawed at the wood for hours. The air was heavy, suffocating, and I felt an overwhelming urge to leave. I shut the door and went back to my room, locking the door behind me. That night, I didn't sleep. The next morning, I told my roommates about the door and what I'd seen. Mark laughed, calling it a prank I was trying to pull, but Sarah looked uneasy. "That door gives me bad vibes," she admitted. "I noticed it last night too, but I thought I was imagining things." We decided to investigate together. This time, the door wouldn't open at all. No matter how much we pushed or pulled, it stayed shut, as if it had never been ajar in the first place. Mark tried jiggling the knob, muttering, "Must be stuck," but I could see the unease creeping onto his face. Over the next few days, strange things began happening. We started hearing noises at odd hours, faint knocking, whispers that didn't belong to any of us, and those same deliberate footsteps in the hallway. The first time Sarah heard them, she burst into my room, pale and shaking. "Someone's in the house," she whispered. But when we searched the place, everything was locked, and no one was there. One evening, Mark was sitting in the living room when he shouted for us to come. When Sarah and I arrived, he pointed toward the mystery door. It was open again, just a crack. "I swear I saw it move," he said, his voice tight. None of us dared to approach it. Instead, we agreed to ignore it. We even propped a chair against the door, hoping that would keep it shut. But that didn't stop the nightmares. I started dreaming about the room, endless darkness, the overturned chair, and something moving in the shadows. In the dream, I was always standing in the doorway, unable to step back or look away. It felt like whatever was inside the room was watching me, waiting for me to step inside. Sarah and Mark confessed they were having similar dreams, though none of us wanted to admit just how terrified we were. We tried to avoid the hallway as much as possible, but the door seemed to demand attention. No matter how often we propped the chair against it, it would end up open again, just enough to show the black void beyond. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again, the faint creak of footsteps. This time, they didn't stop outside my door. They continued down the hallway, growing louder, until they were right outside the mystery door. There was a soft click, like the sound of the knob turning, and then silence. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and rushed out into the hallway, heart pounding. The door was wide open. The room inside was pitch black, just as I remembered, but now the chair was upright in the center, facing me. And then, I heard it. A faint, rasping breath coming from the darkness. The sound of that rasping breath froze me in place. It was uneven, almost wheezing, as though whatever was inside the room was struggling to breathe. My phone flashlight trembled in my hand as I aimed it into the darkness, but the beam seemed swallowed by the void. All I could make out was the chair in the center of the room. I backed away, my heart pounding, but before I could retreat to my room, Mark's door creaked open. He stepped into the hallway, squinting in the dim light. "What's going on?" he asked groggily, but his expression shifted to fear when he saw the open door. "What the?" "Don't go near it," I whispered, my voice shaking. But Mark wasn't the type to back down. He grabbed a baseball bat from his room and approached the door. "If there's someone in there, I'm getting answers," he said, though I could hear the hesitation in his voice. He flicked on the flashlight on his phone and stepped inside. "Mark, don't." Sarah's voice came from behind me as she emerged from her room. She looked terrified, her eyes darting between me and the open door. "You don't know what's in there." Mark ignored us, stepping further into the room. His flashlight beam wavered as he scanned the space, but from the hallway, all we could see was the faint outline of the chair. "It's just an empty room," he called out, though his tone wasn't convincing. "There's nothing." He stopped mid-sentence. His flashlight fell to the floor, the beam flickering wildly as it rolled. Mark stumbled backward into the hallway, his face pale and his breathing ragged. "Something moved," he choked out. It was in the corner. Watching me. Before I could respond, the door slammed shut on its own, the sound reverberating through the house. Mark stumbled into Sarah and me, and we all stared at the closed door, too terrified to move. The chair we propped against it earlier was now on its side, several feet away, as if it had been flung across the hallway. We didn't sleep that night. Mark sat on the couch clutching his bat, while Sarah and I huddled nearby. Every so often, we heard faint noises, scratching, tapping, even muffled whispers, but we refused to investigate. By dawn, the house was eerily quiet again, but the tension lingered. The next day, we tried to act normal. Mark joked about calling a priest, but none of us laughed. I tried looking up the history of the house, hoping for some kind of explanation, but there wasn't much to find. The property had been sold multiple times over the years, often under vague circumstances. One article mentioned the death of a previous tenant, but details were scarce. It was like the house's history had been deliberately erased. That night, Sarah suggested we leave the house altogether. "We should just pack up and go," she said, her voice shaking. "It's not worth this." Mark and I agreed, but none of us wanted to stay behind alone while the others packed. We decided to wait until morning to make our escape. But the house had other plans. Around midnight, the sound of footsteps began again, louder and faster than before. This time, they didn't stop. They raced up and down the hallway, the floorboards groaning under the weight. The noise was deafening, echoing through the house like a stampede. Then came the banging, violent, relentless pounding on the mystery door. And then it stopped. Complete silence. We stared at the door, trembling, as it slowly creaked open on its own. This time, the darkness inside was different, thicker, almost alive. And from deep within the room, a single word echoed, low and guttural, "Stay." The word "stay" echoed in the hallway, low and guttural. None of us could move, frozen by the oppressive weight of the voice. The open door revealed only darkness, but the air felt charged, like something was waiting just beyond the threshold. Mark was the first to break the silence. "We're leaving. Now." He grabbed his car keys and gestured for us to follow. None of us argued. As we hurried toward the front door, the house seemed to come alive. The floor creaked beneath us, and the walls groaned as if they were shifting. A faint whispering filled the air, growing louder with every step. When we reached the front door, it wouldn't budge. Mark pulled and slammed against it, but it was as if the door had fused to the frame. Sarah screamed as the hallway lights flickered, plunging us into near darkness. Behind us, the mystery door slammed shut. Then, slowly, the doorknob began to turn. Mark gripped the bat and stood in front of us, ready to swing, but the door never opened. Instead, the whispering stopped, replaced by a single sound, heavy, deliberate footsteps moving toward us from the other side of the door. The footsteps stopped just on the other side of the door. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then, the knob twisted violently, and the door flung open. Darkness spilled into the hallway, thick and unnatural, swallowing the light from our phones. Mark swung the bat blindly, yelling, "Get back!" But his voice echoed strangely, as if the space had expanded. Something unseen grabbed the bat mid-swing and yanked it out of his hands. Mark stumbled back, and Sarah screamed as the darkness surged toward us. We ran toward the back of the house, desperate to escape. The whispering returned, louder and more dissonant, voices overlapping in a chaotic chorus. The walls seemed to close in, the hallway stretching endlessly as if the house itself was changing. When we finally reached the back door, it too was locked. Mark kicked at it frantically, but it didn't budge. I turned, phone light trembling in my hand, and saw it. A shadowed figure stood at the end of the hallway, tall and formless, with glowing pinpoints where eyes should have been. It began moving toward us, slow but deliberate. My body froze as the temperature plummeted. Sarah grabbed my arm, snapping me out of it. "Window," she shouted. We smashed the nearest window and scrambled out, cutting ourselves on the jagged glass. As soon as we were outside, the house fell silent. No footsteps, no whispers, just the sound of our heavy breathing in the night air. We didn't go back for our things. We drove straight to a motel and stayed there until we could find another place. Days later, I checked online to see if anyone had ever reported similar events. The house had been listed for sale again, but no history of its previous owners was available. Whatever was in that house didn't want us to leave. It wanted us to stay, and I don't think it would have let us go a second time. Story 3. The face in the darkness stared at us, its glowing red eyes piercing through the cold air. The voice, deep and guttural, resonated again. "You will return, or you will stay." Emma clung to my arm, trembling. "What does it want?" she whispered. I didn't have an answer. The shadows from the well crept closer, swirling around our feet like tendrils, cold and suffocating. The spiraling symbols on the ground glowed brighter, pulsing in rhythm with a deep, throbbing hum that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. "We'll return," I shouted, my voice cracking. "We'll go back, just let us go." The face in the well didn't respond, but the shadows paused, their movement slowing. Emma and I took a cautious step back, but the air grew heavier, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. "Leave the way you came," the voice commanded, its tone final. The shadows began to recede, retreating into the depths of the well. The glowing symbols dimmed, and the oppressive hum softened to a faint vibration. Emma and I didn't wait. We turned and ran, retracing our steps as best we could. The forest seemed to part for us now, the path clearer than before. The gate creaked as we passed through, and soon we could see the faint glow of our campsite ahead. When we reached our tent, we didn't stop to pack. We grabbed our bags and bolted for the car, every nerve in my body screaming to keep moving. As we sped down the dirt road away from the forest, the weight of the experience began to sink in. Emma was shaking, tears streaming down her face, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. It wasn't until we reached the main road that I looked in the rearview mirror. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something standing at the edge of the forest, a dark figure with glowing red eyes, watching us leave. I didn't say anything to Emma. I couldn't. We never spoke about that night again. The memory lingers, though, haunting the edges of my mind. Sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear the faint hum, like a warning, or a reminder. We were allowed to leave, but I don't think we were ever truly free.